In October 2023, in a fenced-off patch of the Gobi Desert near the city of Wuwei, engineers switched on a nuclear reactor that needs no river, no lake, and no ocean nearby to cool it down. That single fact breaks almost everything you think you know about nuclear power. Every commercial reactor running on Earth today sits next to a massive body of water, because water is the only thing standing between a hot reactor core and a meltdown. This one sits in a desert, hundreds of miles from any major river, and the fuel that makes it possible does not come from the uranium mines you are probably picturing right now. It comes, in large part, from thorium, a material so common it shows up in ordinary reddish sand on beaches and riverbanks in several countries around the world. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how China built a reactor that runs cooler, safer, and in a place no reactor was ever supposed to work, and why the rest of the world is now quietly racing to catch up. If a video like this is the kind of thing that keeps your brain buzzing after it ends, sticking around and hitting subscribe means you will not miss the next engineering story like it. No pressure, just an open invite for the curious, because there are a lot more of these stories coming. For close to 70 years, thorium looked like a trap disguised as an opportunity, and understanding why takes us back to the middle of the last century. Scientists at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the United States actually built a working thorium molten salt reactor all the way back in the 1960s. It ran for years. It worked. Researchers there proved, with real data and real electricity, that this style of reactor was physically possible using the technology of that era. And then, in the early 1970s, the entire program was defunded and quietly shut down. That decision has puzzled engineers for decades, because you do not normally cancel a technology that is already working. The real reason had almost nothing to do with the science, and almost everything to do with politics. Thorium reactors do not produce large amounts of material that is useful for building nuclear weapons, and during the Cold War, that made them far less attractive to government funders than uranium and plutonium reactors, which did double duty for both energy and defense programs. So the technology sat on a shelf, half-finished, gathering dust for half a century, while conventional uranium reactors became the global standard, powerful, familiar, and permanently tied to locations near large water sources for cooling. There was also a real engineering wall standing in the way, not just a funding problem. And this part matters because it explains why nobody simply picked the old blueprints back up sooner. Molten salt reactors run their fuel dissolved directly inside liquid salt, instead of packed into solid metal rods. And that liquid runs blisteringly hot, hot enough over time to slowly eat through most ordinary metals used in plumbing and containment. Finding materials that could hold that scalding, chemically aggressive salt for years or even decades without cracking, leaking, or corroding was a puzzle nobody had fully solved back in the 20th century. Every serious attempt ran into the exact same wall. The salt slowly attacked whatever pipes and containers were built to hold it, shortening the reactor's realistic working life. Solve that one stubborn problem, and an entirely new category of nuclear power opens wide. Fail to solve it, and you are left with an expensive science experiment that eventually springs a leak. So which one did China's engineering team actually end up with, after 10 years of quiet work in the desert? Think of it like trying to build a kettle that has to hold boiling acid instead of boiling water, and that kettle needs to keep working every single day for 40 years without ever being replaced. Ordinary steel simply cannot do that job. Chinese researchers spent years testing special nickel-based alloys, metals mixed together in careful combinations specifically designed to resist the exact chemical attack that doomed earlier attempts at this technology. They also had to solve a second, quieter problem. How do you even see inside a sealed pipe carrying super hot, glowing liquid salt to check whether corrosion is happening without shutting the entire reactor down to look? Engineers developed specialized monitoring sensors that could sit inside the system itself and continuously report on the health of the metal, essentially giving the reactor a way to describe its own condition in real time, the way a smartwatch tracks a heartbeat without you needing to stop and check a pulse manually. That combination, tougher alloys paired with constant real-time monitoring, is a large part of what separates this modern Chinese program from the abandoned American experiment of the 1960s. Oak Ridge proved the physics could work. Wuwei is now proving the materials can survive long enough to make it practical, not just possible. And proving a concept works in theory is a completely different achievement than proving it can survive year after year of brutal, real-world operating conditions out in an actual desert. Here's the part that sounds almost too simple to be true, so let's slow down and walk through it piece by piece, like following a recipe in a kitchen. Picture a pot of soup simmering steadily on a stove, except instead of vegetables and broth, the soup is a carefully mixed blend of salt and thorium fuel, heated until the salt turns fully liquid, somewhere around 700 degrees Celsius. That liquid fuel then flows continuously through a network of pipes, almost the way hot coffee flows steadily through the tubing of a coffee maker, carrying heat away from the reactor's core and out toward equipment that boils water and spins a turbine to generate electricity. There are no solid fuel rods that need to be swapped out on a strict scheduled shutdown because the fuel itself already exists as a liquid, constantly circulating and reacting as it moves through the system. Now here comes the safety trick that makes this entire design fundamentally different from a conventional reactor, and it is honestly one of the cleverest parts of the whole concept. At the very bottom of the reactor, engineers install a small plug made of frozen salt, kept solid on purpose by a fan blowing a steady stream of cool air directly onto it, similar to how one particular spot on a frozen pond can stay thin because of a hidden underwater spring warming it from below. If the reactor ever overheats, or if the power simply goes out and that cooling fan stops spinning, the frozen plug melts entirely on its own, with no human operator required to press a single button or flip a single switch. The instant it melts, the liquid fuel drains straight downward by gravity into a separate, specially shaped container built specifically to absorb the fuel and stop the nuclear reaction automatically. No backup pumps are required. No emergency generator is required. No frantic control room decision is required. Gravity alone does the entire job by itself, and that is exactly why this style of reactor does not need to sit beside an ocean, lake, or river the way a traditional plant absolutely does. Doesn't it feel strange that the single most important safety system in the whole reactor is basically just let gravity handle it? Stay with the analogy for one more piece, because the desert connection ties in directly here too. Traditional water-cooled reactors need enormous, continuous amounts of water constantly cycling through their systems, because if the electric pumps and the main power grid both fail at the exact same moment, water is the only backup keeping the reactor core from overheating into a genuine crisis. A molten salt reactor simply does not have that same desperate, minute-by-minute dependence on water, because its own liquid fuel is designed to drain itself into a safe, cooled-down state the moment something goes wrong. That single design choice is the entire reason engineers could place this experimental reactor in the middle of the Gobi Desert, one of the driest and most water-starved regions anywhere in China, and still reasonably expect it to run safely for years. There is one more layer to the mechanism worth understanding, because it explains why this reactor also runs at a much lower pressure than a conventional plant. A normal water-cooled reactor has to keep its cooling water squeezed under enormous pressure, sometimes over 150 times normal atmospheric pressure, just to stop that water from instantly boiling away at the reactor's operating temperature. All that pressure is itself a hazard, because a cracked pipe under that kind of force can fail violently and suddenly. The molten salt inside tmsr-LF1, by contrast, stays liquid at normal atmospheric pressure, even at 700 degrees Celsius, roughly the same pressure as the air around you right now. Picture the difference between a can of soda shaken up and ready to explode the moment you crack it open, compared to a mug of hot tea sitting calmly on a table. Removing that pressure removes an entire category of accident risk that conventional reactors have to engineer around constantly. Let's ground all of this in real names and real numbers now, because a story this big deserves specifics attached to it, not vague promises. The reactor itself is called tmsr-LF1, which stands for Thorium Molten Salt Reactor, liquid-fueled, and it was designed and built by the Shanghai Institute of Applied Physics, a research body under the Chinese Academy of Sciences. The broader Thorium program was formally approved by Chinese authorities back in 2011, and construction on this specific test reactor near Wuwei in Gansu province began in earnest around 2018. It is intentionally a small test unit, generating roughly 2 megawatts of thermal power, tiny compared to a full-scale commercial power plant that might generate 1,000 times more. The point of building it this small was never raw output. The entire point was proving, with a real physical machine, that the underlying concept genuinely works outside a laboratory chalkboard. The reactor achieved what engineers call criticality, meaning it successfully started a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction for the very first time on October 11, 2023. Chinese state media outlets and researchers publishing in scientific journals confirmed the milestone publicly through the following months, once the operating team had gathered enough real-world data to be confident the results were solid and repeatable. That confirmation process itself tells you something important, because Chinese officials did not rush to announce success the moment the reactor first switched on. They waited, tested, and verified before going public, which is exactly the kind of caution you want from anyone operating something this experimental. Then, in the summer of 2024, the team accomplished something that had not been achieved anywhere on the planet since the original Oak Ridge experiments quietly shut down decades earlier. They refueled the reactor while it was still actively running, adding fresh thorium fuel into the system without powering the whole reactor down first. Take a moment and think about how enormous the practical impact of that single achievement really is. A conventional nuclear plant has to schedule planned shutdowns, sometimes lasting several weeks at a time, purely to refuel, and every single day a plant sits offline is a day it earns exactly zero electricity revenue for its operators. A reactor design that can refuel on the fly, without ever fully stopping, could theoretically run for years at a stretch with dramatically less downtime than any conventional plant on Earth today. Chinese researchers have already published the long-term roadmap out loud, rather than keeping it vague or secret. A larger 10-megawatt version of this reactor is being targeted for construction by around 2030. And if that stage goes as planned, a full 100-megawatt commercial-scale thorium reactor is being targeted for sometime around 2035. That is not a private startup throwing around an ambitious marketing slogan to attract investors. That is a government-backed national research laboratory publishing an actual, dated construction and scaling timeline for the public record. The Wuwei site itself was reportedly chosen with real intention behind it, not picked at random off a map. Gansu province sits in China's dry northwest interior, an area the government has already earmarked for large-scale energy projects precisely because it has so much open, low-value desert land and so little competition for water resources compared to China's crowded eastern coastline, where most of the country's existing nuclear plants currently sit clustered near the sea. Placing an experimental reactor somewhere this remote also gave engineers a wide safety buffer while the technology was still being proven, far from major population centers, while still keeping the facility close enough to existing power infrastructure to feed useful data and eventually electricity back into the grid. It also helps to understand just how small and deliberately cautious this whole program has been kept, at least so far. 2 megawatts of thermal power is roughly enough energy to heat a few hundred homes, nowhere close to the output of a real power station. Chinese engineers reportedly designed the test reactor this small on purpose, specifically so that if something unexpected did go wrong during these early years of testing, the consequences would stay small and contained, rather than becoming a genuine public safety event. That is a meaningfully different approach than rushing straight to a full-size commercial plant and hoping the physics cooperates. And it mirrors the same cautious, step-by-step philosophy that guided the original Oak Ridge experiments back in the 1960s, just picked back up and carried further than anyone had managed before. So does any of this actually hold up once you step outside a research paper? Or is it still essentially theory dressed up as real progress? This is exactly where the story becomes genuinely exciting, because tmsr-LF1 is not a blueprint sitting untouched on some engineer's hard drive somewhere in Shanghai. It is a physical machine, built out of real steel and real salt, fueled with real thorium, and already operating out in the actual desert today, right now, as you watch this. The successful criticality test in October 2023 and the online refueling breakthrough in the summer of 2024 are documented, independently reported events, not distant projections about what might happen someday if funding comes through. China has effectively resurrected and completed a technology that the United States pioneered decades ago and then simply walked away from. And it did so in one of the harshest, driest environments on the entire planet, precisely the kind of location a traditional water-hungry reactor could never realistically be built in the first place. If a 2-megawatt test reactor genuinely works this reliably in the middle of a desert, what does that actually mean for every other dry, landlocked region on Earth that has been permanently locked out of nuclear power until now? Let's zoom out and think about the bigger picture for a moment, because the implications stretch far beyond one test site in Gansu province. Think about how much of the world simply cannot use nuclear power today, no matter how badly some of these countries might want the clean, steady, around-the-clock electricity it provides. Vast deserts across northern Africa, the Middle East, western China, and inland Australia all sit far from the oceans and major rivers that conventional reactors absolutely depend on for their cooling water. If thorium molten salt reactors prove they can scale up safely from 2 megawatts to 100 megawatts and beyond, entire regions that were permanently locked out of nuclear energy for geographic reasons alone could suddenly become genuine candidates for it. There is also a practical size advantage worth mentioning, because it changes who can realistically afford to build one of these plants in the first place. A conventional nuclear power station is a massive undertaking, often costing many billions of dollars and taking well over a decade to plan, permit, and construct, which effectively limits ownership to wealthy national governments or huge utility companies. Molten salt reactor designs, by contrast, are naturally suited to smaller, modular construction, built in factory-produced sections and assembled on site, rather than poured and welded together from scratch over 10 years. That difference could eventually put nuclear power within reach of mid-sized economies and regional power authorities that could never have realistically financed a traditional plant, opening up an entirely new customer base for nuclear energy that simply did not exist before. There is also the fuel supply question itself, and it turns out to be surprisingly favorable. Thorium is roughly 3 to 4 times more abundant in the Earth's crust than uranium is, and it is frequently found concentrated within monazite sand deposits, the same reddish-brown sand mined in coastal parts of India, Australia, and China, largely for the separate rare earth elements it also contains. Countries currently sitting on enormous, largely unused thorium reserves, India especially, are reportedly watching this specific Chinese reactor program extremely closely, since a working, proven design would suddenly turn a resource they already have in abundance into a genuine strategic energy asset. Think about what that actually means for the raw math of nuclear fuel supply going forward. A single ton of thorium, according to figures cited by proponents of the technology, can theoretically release roughly as much energy as several hundred tons of coal when used in a well-designed reactor, though real-world efficiency depends heavily on the specific reactor design and how completely the fuel gets used before it is removed. Even accounting for real-world losses, that ratio is the kind of number that makes energy planners sit up and pay attention, because it means a relatively small, easily transportable quantity of fuel could realistically power a community for a very long stretch of time, all while producing a noticeably smaller volume of long-term radioactive waste than conventional uranium fuel cycles typically leave behind. There is a geopolitical layer running underneath all of this too, and it is worth being completely honest about it rather than pretending energy technology exists in a vacuum. Nuclear energy has never really been just about electricity generation. It has always doubled as a very public demonstration of a nation's engineering capability and global technological influence. If China becomes the first country in the world to turn a decades-old, abandoned American concept into an actual working commercial power source, that sends a fairly loud, unmistakable message about who currently holds the lead in next-generation energy technology. The United States, Japan, and several nations across Europe all have their own thorium and molten salt research programs quietly underway behind closed laboratory doors. But right now, today, China is the country with an actual physical reactor already generating power and successfully refueling itself out in the field. That gap between merely in development and genuinely already running is essentially the entire ballgame in a technology race like this one, and it is not a small gap to close. It is also worth remembering that China is not treating this as an isolated side project buried inside one research institute. The country has folded thorium research into its broader, decades-long national push to diversify its energy mix away from heavy dependence on coal, which still generates the majority of China's electricity today, despite years of investment in solar, wind, and conventional nuclear power. A working, water-independent nuclear option gives Chinese planners a tool that solar and wind simply cannot offer on their own: a steady, always-on source of electricity that does not depend on sunshine, wind speed, or a nearby river, and can be sited almost anywhere the government chooses to put it, including regions the existing power grid has historically struggled to serve reliably. Consider what this could mean for China's own domestic energy strategy specifically, beyond just international bragging rights. China currently imports a significant share of the uranium it uses to fuel its existing fleet of conventional nuclear plants, which creates a supply chain dependency on other countries and global uranium markets. Thorium, by comparison, is something China already has in meaningful quantities within its own borders, particularly as a byproduct of its large domestic rare earth mining industry, an industry China already dominates globally for entirely separate reasons. A successful thorium reactor program would let China convert a material it already digs up in large quantities, almost as industrial leftover, into a genuine strategic energy resource, reducing reliance on imported uranium over time. That kind of self-sufficiency angle tends to matter enormously to national energy planners, maybe even more than the cleaner engineering itself. Energy independence, after all, is the kind of thing governments plan decades in advance around, not something they leave to chance or to the shifting price of an imported fuel controlled by other nations. Now let's slow down and be completely honest about the road still ahead, because it would be misleading to end this story sounding like every problem has already been solved. A 2-megawatt test reactor succeeding quietly in the desert does not automatically guarantee that a full-scale 100-megawatt commercial plant will run just as smoothly years from now. The corrosion problem that effectively killed this technology back in the 1960s has been meaningfully improved through decades of materials research, but it has not been permanently and completely solved. Engineers are still closely monitoring exactly how quickly that superheated, chemically aggressive salt wears down pipes and containment vessels over many months and years of continuous, uninterrupted operation. And genuine long-term data at true commercial scale simply does not exist yet anywhere on the planet, because nobody has run a plant this large for that many years. There is also the question of cost, and this one is genuinely hard to answer with confidence right now. Building the very first working example of any new technology is almost always far more expensive than building the 10th or the 100th one, once the design has been refined and the manufacturing process has been streamlined. Nobody outside the program has an independently verified figure for exactly how much tmsr costs to design, build, and test, and Chinese authorities have not published a detailed public breakdown of the spending involved. Until a full 100 megawatt commercial version is actually built and connected to the grid, any comparison to the cost of a conventional uranium reactor remains, at best, an educated guess rather than a settled fact. And the same is true for how long the plant would realistically need to run before it pays back its own construction cost. That uncertainty alone is a completely normal part of bringing any brand new energy technology to market, but it is worth stating plainly rather than glossing over. Scaling the design from 2 megawatts all the way up to 100 megawatts is also not simply a matter of building the exact same reactor bigger and calling it done. Larger scale introduces entirely new engineering challenges around heat management, material stress under sustained pressure, and construction costs that a small experimental test unit sitting quietly in the desert never truly has to face. And there is a radioactive byproduct issue worth mentioning honestly as well. Thorium reactors produce a substance called uranium-233 as a natural byproduct of normal operation, and that material comes with its own distinct handling, storage, and long-term safety considerations that regulators around the world are still actively working through, case by case, country by country. There is also the matter of independent verification, which matters a great deal when a program this sensitive is largely reported through domestic state media and academic journals connected to the same national laboratory running the project. Outside nuclear experts and international regulatory bodies have not had the same level of hands-on access to inspect tmsr-LF1 that they typically get with reactors built under fully open international frameworks. That does not mean the reported results are false. The criticality event and the online refueling milestone both line up with details independently discussed by nuclear physicists outside China who track the program closely. But a healthy amount of patience is still warranted until more independently verified operating data becomes publicly available over the coming years. None of these particular problems appear to be complete deal breakers based on everything published so far, but anyone out there claiming this technology is already flawless, fully proven, and ready for worldwide deployment tomorrow would be getting noticeably ahead of the actual available evidence. So here is the entire idea, boiled all the way down into a nutshell. China built a small nuclear reactor in the middle of a punishing desert that runs on liquid salt instead of solid fuel rods, cools itself down automatically using nothing more advanced than gravity, and successfully refueled itself while still running, a genuine feat that nobody on Earth had pulled off since the 1970s. It is real, it is documented, it is already operating right now, and it could eventually unlock practical nuclear power for water-scarce regions spanning the entire globe. If engineering stories like this one are the kind of thing you want to keep discovering as they happen, liking this video and subscribing to the channel means the next breakthrough shows up right in your feed instead of quietly getting buried by the algorithm, and turning on notifications means you catch it the very moment it drops. So tell me this down in the comments below. If thorium reactors like this one eventually prove themselves out at full commercial scale, which desert region of the world do you personally think should get the very first one built there? And why does that particular location make the most sense to you?